welcome to the Total Soccer Show. I'm Taylor Rockwell. No Daryl with me today. Instead, I am talking to the Athletics' Caitlin Murray. We're going to break down what happened in the USA's 3-1 loss to France, as well as their 1-0 win over Spain. I think I was a little bit more dramatic about those results than Caitlin was, so it was very nice to have her on to sort of explain what was going on, make me feel less fearful, make me feel more confident about the U.S. women's team, if that's even possible, because they're pretty good. So it's a good 30-minute conversation. We talk about lots of different things, including who might make the team, who might not make the team, like what was so good about France and how they look so strong, and then looking into the team itself and some of the tactics and formations that Jill Ellis used against France and whether or not she'll use them again in the future. So as I said, lots of great content. It's a great interview, and I look forward to you listening to it. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Caitlin Murray of The Athletic. Joining me now, I've got Caitlin Murray of The Athletic. Caitlin, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me about the U.S. women's national team.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure, and I'm very excited to have you because Daryl is away, and we were going to break down the USA-France game. Then I think timing didn't work out, but I'm excited to have like an expert on to help me make sense of what happened in these last two friendlies because I am no expert when it comes to the U.S. women's national team, but it feels like they were not the results they were looking for.
No, but you got to start somewhere. It's the opening of the World Cup year for the team. They've been pretty rusty, so we'll dive into it. But I don't think anyone should freak out yet.
All right, that was actually one of my first questions was should we freak out? So I'm glad you've already answered that. Well done. But going into these games, like, did you have any sort of trepidation? Did you have any concerns about France or Spain? Did you feel like the winning streak would continue?
Well, I mean, France is a favorite. They're going to be hosting the World Cup. They have a lot of talent. I mean, it was obviously going to be a difficult test for the Americans. These games were also in France. The U.S. actually doesn't play outside the United States that often. So these were designed to be difficult games. And I guess I hadn't really thought about whether the streak would end. But, going into these games, the U.S. was pretty rusty. I mean, these players haven't actually played any games since the November friendlies for the national team, and the NWSL has been off since September. The French players are in season. They've been playing with the national team. So the U.S. was a little rusty. And then I think, a question going into these games was how was Jill Ellis going to use these games?
Yeah.
Was she going to experiment and try some different things, or was she going to try to hit the ground running and put in her best 11, give them time together, try to win these games? And I think what we saw is that Jill Ellis did experiment. She did use these games as opportunities to play players who we probably won't see in the World Cup. So from that standpoint, that really ended up affecting how these games went because I don't think we saw the best U.S. team that is available. I don't think we saw the team that's going to be starting in France. So the fact that the U.S. lost to France in this friendly, I think you have to kind of put that in perspective.
I would agree with everything you said, but I do want to start off when it comes to the team with, did you watch the French stream of this game or did you have English language commentators?
No, I watched the one on Fox.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Okay, so the Fox Soccer Match Pass one was the French punditry, which was interesting, but they kept calling her Mallory Pug, and I took offense. I didn't like that. I didn't like Mallory Pug.
Yeah.
That was an interesting one that maybe it changed the lens of the game for me. But I'm with you that it definitely felt a little rusty, and that was one of the first questions I wanted to get to about specific players was Alex Morgan, it seemed like, was offside a lot, and it made me think about it. Like, I feel like in a lot of games I see she gets flagged for offside, and that's normal if you're a striker. And maybe it was just the case that against France it seemed to happen more, or it seemed like she protested more. And I'm wondering, is that a thing that's kind of common in her game, or do you think that's an example of the U.S. being rusty?
I think it's both. I think it's not rare to see Alex Morgan be offside. I mean, that's really indicative of the type of game the U.S. plays. Alex Morgan is a striker. They, when they're in trouble or when they get a moment of transition, they're picking their heads up and looking to get Alex Morgan in behind the back lines. So you're going to see that a lot, where they're trying to spring her in behind back lines. And, when you're cutting it close, that's going to lead to offside. But it is also just the rust factor.
Mm-hmm.
These players haven't been together. Those being able to read each other, the communication, being in sync, all those things are going to kind of come as they're ramping up for the World Cup and they get more time together. So I would say your observation is not off base. I think it's certainly not rare to see her offside. But, the hope, I think, is that as this team plays together more, that's not going to happen as much.
That makes sense to me. But it's you mentioned earlier that this probably is a team that may not have a lot of starters, the team we saw go out against France. Why do you think Jill Ellis wanted to do that? I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I felt like Julie Ertz not starting was a big deal. I felt like Kristen Press on the left as a winger instead of Megan Rapinoe. That felt like maybe one that would change, and then the fullbacks as well. So why do you think she played a sort of, if not second-string team, then a more experimental team against France?
Well, U.S. Soccer did come out and say that some players are being held back just as precaution. So Heath, Ertz, O'Hara's just coming back from injury. So there were a few players being held out for that reason. But I also think that, the 2016 Olympics and the U.S. being knocked out has kind of been the traumatizing moment in the history of this team, where they were knocked out at the early stage in a major tournament ever. And one of the things I always think about when I think back to that game was the game management wasn't very good in that game. The game ended with Tobin Heath playing right back. You don't want that to happen. So Jill Ellis, I think, is trying to test different players' versatility, see how else they can be useful to the team. That's why we saw Crystal Dunn in the central midfield. Yeah. I think when, the World Cup rolls around, she is going to be a left back. But it doesn't hurt for Jill Ellis to kind of look at different scenarios. Okay, if we need to move Crystal Dunn, what does the central midfield look like if we put her there? What is it like if she's on the wing or something like that? So I think that's one thing, just testing different game states, pushing players to see what else they can do. And then, with Emily Fox, who had a pretty rough outing against France. It was only her third cap. She's 20 years old. I do not think she's going to be on the World Cup roster. But fullback is not an area of depth for this team. It's not an area of depth for the men's team. It's just like a U.S. problem at that position. And I think that Jill Ellis kind of wanted to see if maybe there were some options that she hasn't, explored to their fullest potential yet. So, I thought that Jill Ellis could have tried to hit the ground running, but I think, there were 10 games between then and the World Cup, and I think she kind of wanted to use some of those first games to figure some things out. And then I think the last possibility, which is hard to say, I don't think Jill Ellis would admit to this, but maybe playing possum a little bit with France, because depending how the group stages at the World Cup go, depending how the round of 16 goes, the U.S. could end up facing France in the quarterfinal of the World Cup. So if that's going to happen, Jill Ellis is not going to lay all her cards out, to open 2019.
See, I was wondering that, because I had that same thought, and then I was like, or am I just am I being a Jill Ellis apologist? Do I just want that to be the case? But I wondered that about, some of the players who were involved. I know you said maybe they're being held back a little bit, but it did make me wonder, if some of the experimentation, playing Emily Fox, who is still in college, correct? Is she still at UNC?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To start her against France, that felt a little bit, maybe it was throwing her into the deep end and seeing how it would go, but I did then wonder, or is this oh, look how bad we are at fullback, look how you all exploited that, you should definitely try to do that, and then we'll just bunker at fullback against you if we see you in the World Cup. So maybe I'm too inclined to give Jill Ellis the benefit of the doubt and this team the benefit of the doubt, but I did wonder that same thing, so I'm glad to know I'm not crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at a player like Tierna Davidson, and I think she was just kind of thrown in to see how well she could do, and I think she really surprised everyone in how well she was playing as a center back. She just kind of quickly went from someone no one had really considered as someone who could make the World Cup roster to someone who I fully expect to make the World Cup roster. So I think it was kind of the same methodology with Fox, which is let's just throw her in, see how she does.
And so Davidson returned. Sorry, I'm not sure if I lost you there. But so Davidson returns from the long-term injury. Who do you think then is going to be Jill Ellis's starting center back pair, if you had to guess right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's pretty much between Davidson, Dahlkemper, and Sauerbrunn at this point. I think, Sauerbrunn is not maybe as quick as she has been in the past, but I would also say that her game was never really built on speed. It's more of her ability to read plays as they develop, her soccer IQ, her leadership abilities. So I would still start Sauerbrunn. I think you do need a veteran presence on that back line. So probably Sauerbrunn. And I think, honestly, Davidson has shown really well. I could see that, but I think it's going to be a competition between Davidson and Dahlkemper at this point.
That makes sense to me. What then did you make of the U.S.'s backline performance against France? Because the other thing, like aside from Emily Fox having a not very good day, it did feel like France were very much intent on exposing the relative lack of pace in that defense or the high line that the U.S. was playing. Did that give you any concern at all as a person who watches this team, that it felt like maybe they were a little bit slower and did struggle with some of the pace, especially from Cascarino?
Yeah, I think the thing that jumps out from your question there is that this actually isn't a new problem or concern. I think that the U.S. plays so aggressive, and Jill Ellis wants them to play so aggressive, that I think sort of just an overlying concern is that are they exposing themselves too much? Because, I've spoken to Jill Ellis about kind of the depth chart across the positions, and she really wants her fullbacks to be attacking players. And it's no surprise then that Kelly O'Hara, a former forward, is the starting right back. Crystal Dunn, who is an attacking player all her life, is the left back. She wants the defense to be part of the attack. And I think that really runs the risk of exposing the U.S. team. And, I haven't really seen an answer to that or a way to address it. I think that the thinking is that they're just going to outscore their opponents. The U.S. just has a really attacking style of play, and, they don't have a lot of speed. And I think we saw that on the third goal that France scored. Nair made the decision to come out. She was kind of caught in no man's land, and no one was able to get back and cover. And I think that's one of those things that you have to keep an eye on. I mean, I don't know how they're going to address it, but they're certainly not going to abandon this ultra aggressive attacking style of play that Jill Ellis wants.
Do you think that they'll also stick with the sort of, at least this seemed to me like a sort of midfield rotation where, especially against France, where it was Harayan, Dunn, and Morgan Bryan, it felt like they had those three in there. They kept roughly like one deeper, two a little bit further forward, but it at times was Dunn. It was predominantly Bryan and Harayan switching place, it felt like. And on the one hand, I see how that could be useful, that it's like, okay, you've always got somebody kind of sitting deep and screening. But on the other, if they're always kind of moving around, it feels like no one is ever 100% focused on that, and it feels like that's a key way to kind of slow things down. So do you think we'll continue to see a little bit of rotation, or was that maybe a byproduct of not having Julie Ertz as that deep player?
I think that's what Jill Ellis wants. She talks about the players being able to interchange. There's a lot of fluidity. And I think that's because they want to be able to be unpredictable. They want to be able to be responsive in moments to kind of just take opportunities to attack. It's interesting, in 2015, the way they were playing is it wasn't a three-woman central midfield. It was two-woman central midfield, and it was primarily Carly Lloyd and Lauren Holiday. And it was the same sort of thing where they didn't have these defined roles. They just sort of switched off, and it didn't really work. I think they had a lot of problems in the central midfield, and when they, the flip was switched and they started playing better was when Lauren Holiday got suspended for yellow card accumulation. Morgan Bryan went in there. She was told to hold so Carly Lloyd could attack. Mm-hmm. They had these more defined positions, and then they suddenly played a lot better. So it's going to be interesting to see. I think that the central midfield that we saw in these games, I don't think are going to be the starters. I think at this point, you're going to have Rose Lavelle as sort of the number 10, Lindsey Horan is the number 8, Julie Ertz is the 6. I think that's probably what we'll see. And I think those players, as they get more reps together, I think those rotations and the way they play together should be a little more organized and a little more comfortable. I think you could kind of tell that the central midfield that, you talked about was not one that had played together very much. I mean, Crystal Dunn is not a central midfielder for this team. So, that was a pretty interesting choice to put her in there.
Yeah.
So I think that I think you raise an interesting point, and it's going to be something to kind of keep an eye on going forward.
We'll get back to my chat with Caitlin Murray of The Athletic in just a moment, but first, I wanted to let you know that today's episode of The Total Soccer Show is brought to you by Talisman Caps. Talisman Caps are a timeless accessory that will endure both physically and aesthetically. That is true. They're well made. They hold up. I've been wearing my Cuauhtemoc Blanco Talisman hat that we got in Chicago this summer. I wear it pretty regularly. Looks just fine to me. But they've got lots of other options, both at club level. They've got individual players. They've got the Maradona holding a beer and the Pirlo holding a glass of wine. That seems appropriate. We asked them why it was Maradona holding a beer and not maybe other substances. They said no comment. That was fair. Talisman was founded by a former professional soccer player, Dustin Brannon, who wanted to create a sort of lifestyle streetwear gear that you could feel proud to wear on and off the pitch. And I would say you can do that with Talisman because they've got like the more fashionable ones, so you can look good going to the game. And then if you don't want to wear a hat during pickup, maybe you wear the Valderrama one and you be inspired by El Pibe. That is up to you. But what is also great about Talisman is that they're offering our listeners 20% off with the minimum purchase of $35, which is worth noting is the cost of one cap. So not too big of a struggle there. If you use the promo code TOTALSOCCER20, all one word, all together, when you check out, you will get 20% off that purchase. So thank you very much to Talisman for sponsoring today's episode. Again, we're really happy to have them on the show. We love their hats. We may do some giveaways in the near future. We'll see how that goes. But for now, thank you to Talisman. Now back to my conversation with Caitlin. Oh, you mentioned Crystal Dunn there. Why do you think she keeps getting moved around? Because I'm with you that it seems like she's going to be utilized as an attacking fullback, but sometimes we see her like as a right winger. Sometimes she's in the middle. Sometimes she's on the left. What is it like? Is it Jill Ellis just trying to see where she can best utilize her versatility, or is it just that Crystal Dunn is so versatile that like if Jill Ellis doesn't have a right winger for a game, she can just throw Crystal Dunn in there?
Yeah, I mean, Crystal Dunn is good everywhere. And, you ask Crystal Dunn about it, and she says she's just kind of, sarcastically, she's had to be Miss Versatility for the national team. That's just kind of the job that she's had over the years. She is good everywhere, and that is useful, again, for different game states. When, late in the game, if they're really pushing for a goal, and they're going to go to a 3-back formation or something like that, they can push Crystal Dunn up. I think Jill Ellis does want to give her reps in some different roles to make her comfortable with it. But she will be a left back for the team just because she's the best left back option they have. They have like 9 people vying for a central midfield spot. She's not needed there. They have plenty of depth on the wings. She's not needed there. So I think when it comes down to need, it's just where does the U.S. team need her? That's where she's going to play. So within a game, that might change depending on kind of what happens in the game management. But to start games, I mean, it's going to be as left back. But
if something happened to her, if she went down or if she just needed a rest, who are the other candidates to either like maybe challenge for a starting left back spot or be the backup on the squad in France?
So I think that we're going to see some utility players. I mean, Jill Ellis was testing Tierna Davidson as a left back, which I thought was interesting. She showed she could do it. So, I mean, that was one of those experiments that Jill Ellis conducted that I think was actually useful. We've seen Emily Sonnet is usually a center back. She's been playing as a right back, which I think is interesting. Casey Short hasn't gotten a lot of minutes lately for the national team, and I'm a little perplexed by that. I think that she probably should be the backup in that role. She was held back from the France game as one of those precautionary injuries, but in general, it seems like Jill Ellis has been searching for other options there. I think when push comes to shove, it probably will be Casey Short, but I'm guessing just because Casey Short hasn't actually played that much. So I would definitely keep an eye on Casey Short and whether, we see her get some more playing time in the lead up to the World Cup.
And are there other players who performed or didn't perform in these friendlies that you think either increased their chances of going, that maybe they were on the outside looking in, now they maybe are in that squad or in consideration, and vice versa? Do you think there are any players who sort of effectively ruled themselves out of contention?
Yeah, so I think, this isn't a player who was at risk of not making the World Cup team, but Kristen Press was, I think, the best player for the U.S. across both games, the France game and the Spain game. She was the best player on the field as a winger, and the winger roles are going to belong to Megan Rapinoe and Tobin Heath. And I don't really see a world where those aren't the two starters.
Yeah.
But if Kristen Press keeps playing as well as she did in these two games, I think she can at least force a conversation. And I think that that's an interesting possibility because Kristen Press, is really a number 9, but for this national team, she hasn't been able to kind of solidify that role. So she's been a winger, and she's really taken to the role, I'd say, over the last, the last year. So she's someone who I think absolutely raised her stock. She was going to France anyway, but I think, Jill Ellis might want to find a way to get her on the field and get her some minutes. I think that.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to jump in real fast to say that makes complete sense to me because watching her, again, not being as familiar with everything she brings, knowing she's a very good goal scorer, knowing she's very fast, it was interesting that when the team did seem a little discombobulated, when it felt like, oh, that run was on and the ball didn't come, or that run wasn't on and they played the ball anyway, it felt like Kristen Press was the one who was just like, all right, you know what, I'm just going to score. I'm just going to take it and dribble real fast. And it did feel like her kind of individual ability could be very critical in a game where somebody's just got to make a move or get a shot off. Maybe she makes that happen. So I'm with you that it feels like I came out of these thinking all right, Kristen Press on the wing, I could be okay with that, even if it's unlikely to happen. So I'm definitely with you there on that one.
Yeah, I mean, you need game changers in a World Cup, and I think Carly Lloyd sort of proved that. She's a player who just kind of on her own would change games. So if Kristen Press can be that player, they're going to find a place for her. In terms of other players that raise their stock, I think the question going into these games is who is the backup number 9 behind Alex Morgan then? If it's not Kristen Press, I think it's probably Carly Lloyd. But Jessica McDonald, she came in for the Spain game, and I thought she played pretty well. I think we do need to see more from her, but she's a player who I think a month ago I would have said is probably not going to the World Cup, but I think there is a possibility that there could be a role for her, especially if she keeps getting minutes and keeps playing well. And then players who I think maybe hurt their chances a little bit. I thought that Morgan Bryan did not look up to the task against France. It was a rough outing for her, and I think we all remember what she did in 2015. Like I mentioned, she came in and played that holding role, and that really changed the U.S.'s fortunes in that World Cup. The U.S. wasn't actually playing very well until she came in and kind of solidified that midfield. But she really hasn't been in very good form over, I would say, the last couple years. And that was really apparent against France. She just could not seem to keep up, hold on to the ball. I mean, it was just kind of a rough day for her. So I think you come out of that game looking at the amount of central midfield depth that is available, the options that Jill Ellis has. I don't know where Morgan Bryan fits in. She's a player who I still think probably would make the World Cup team. I think Jill Ellis really likes her, but if she keeps having games like that, I mean, I don't know if it would be a shock for her to not make the roster. So, that's a player to watch. Emily Fox, we already spoke about her. That was a rough one.
Yeah.
And then another player who I think, you asked about players who maybe their stock went down. I think just the fact that Adriana Franch did not get on the field was not good for her, because I think you look at the goalkeeper pool right now, people who are following women's soccer and watching it and paying attention, I think Adriana Franch is actually in the best form of any of the goalkeepers, but she still has 0 caps for the national team. So I think the chances of her being able to be a number 2, being able to have an important spot on the World Cup team, I think is dwindling pretty quickly.
Why is that? I've heard people talk about this before with Jill Ellis and about her tendency to play the same goalkeeper every single time, even if she's experimenting elsewhere. Why do you feel that's the case, that she doesn't like kind of giving other goalkeepers a run, or if they have 2 friendlies, why doesn't she split those shifts?
Yeah, I mean, that was a problem when Hope Solo was the starting goalkeeper, was that the backups behind her weren't getting any reps, which didn't make a ton of sense, because Hope Solo had a ton of experience. She was clearly the starter, and the people behind her didn't have that many reps. So that was a bit of a mystery. So then Hope Solo gets kicked off the team. At the time, Alyssa Nair had 7 caps for the national team, and Jill Ellis, I think, was forced into a decision about, okay, who's going to be our number 1? Who do we need to invest caps and minutes in? And she chose Alyssa Nair. And now I think she is in a situation where Nair still doesn't have a ton of international experience. I mean, certainly, I think Nair is getting better every game and kind of improving her communication with the back line and getting more comfortable. And I think she doesn't want to siphon time away from Nair to give, Ashlyn Harris or Adriana Franch time. I think it's still the after effects of starting Hope Solo over and over again when Hope Solo was with the team. I think now at this point, if Nair is going to be the starter in France, then you need to make sure she is absolutely as prepared as possible. So, I do think that Adriana Franch should get some time. I think, the goalkeeper position, if Nair gets injured, then they're kind of forced into the same situation again, where they have these goalkeepers that maybe don't have as much experience, or certainly don't have any recent experience on the international level. So, I do think that maybe Jill Ellis could be bringing in some different goalkeepers for some halves or something, but she's clearly made a decision. Alyssa Nair is our number 1, so we need to invest in her. So that's what she's doing.
And from what you've heard, like, how is the state of the locker room? Because talking about Ashlyn Harris and Franch not getting any opportunities, like, it did make me wonder if there's any resentment there, or if there's any sort of locker room issues that Jill Ellis might have to sort out, or is it a pretty harmonious group by all accounts?
Well, I do know that in 2017, so Jill Ellis was doing a lot of experiments. The team was dropping results. I do know that there were some players who spoke to Sunil Gulati at US Soccer about that. They weren't happy with how things were going. And after that point, the U.S. has been winning ever since. They went on a 28-game winning streak. And just talking to players, I was at World Cup qualifying in October, and just kind of talking to the players, asking them about how things have changed since then. It does seem like they feel a lot better about the direction of the team. What I've heard from sources is that things have gotten a lot better. People are on board with the direction the team is going. They feel confident. I haven't heard that there's any issues now. I think there was a point where there were some concerns, but the team has corrected those. By qualifying, the team was in great form, and I think everyone was in really high spirits. And I don't know that a loss to open 2019 is going to change that. I mean, in 2015, they lost their first game of the year then as well. It was also to France. It was also in France. And then, they eventually went on to win the World Cup. So I don't think anyone is freaking out about this game. And by all accounts, I've heard that the team feels good about where they're at.
All right. Well, then flipping it around, let's talk about France for just 1 second. Obviously, they're always going to be a strong team. Were you surprised by how strong they looked? And did you see anything in there that made you sort of think, okay, that's something that the U.S. is definitely going to have to figure out because otherwise there could be problems?
Was not surprised by how good they look. I mean, they're a great team. They always are. And I mean, you do have to keep in mind, France is in season. Their players have been playing in Champions League. They were always going to be in better form than the U.S. in these games. We saw, Diani, who scored, I think she scored a couple goals. She's a young player who I think the World Cup could be a big breakout tournament for her. She is not someone who has, performed on that level before on that big stage. So I think it's going to be really exciting to see this team host a World Cup. The perennial worry with France is that they have always had a lot of talent. They've always been a very good team, and then they just kind of crumble under the pressure in big tournaments. We've seen it time and time again. So on one hand, you think the fact that the World Cup is being hosted in France, that should give them a boost. That should really help them out. On the other hand, you kind of wonder, is that going to add even more pressure? Is that going to make it even more difficult for them? Because the French team, just for all their quality and how good they are, they have really never been able to manage the pressure that well in World Cups.
So it is then kind of like the similar vibe / narrative to the men's team then of can be world beaters and can win the World Cup, but can also self-destruct pretty spectacularly.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that we saw with the men's team was how much their depth mattered in the World Cup. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, how the French team does in that regard. I don't think, for instance, the French team is as deep as the U.S. team. And if depth matters in World Cups, I think the U.S. should be the favorites, and I think the pressure is on for the U.S. to perform pretty well in that regard.
All right, and you were talking about how it's like an exciting time earlier. I know it's also an exciting time for you because I believe you have a book coming out. Is that correct?
Yes.
Are you allowed to tell us things about it?
Yes. Okay. So the book is called The National Team. It's about the U.S. women's national team. It's sort of the narrative history of the team. So if you're a casual fan of the team and haven't followed it that closely, this book will kind of take you through everything and you'll be able to follow along with the story. If you are a diehard fan of the U.S. women's national team, this book is providing a lot of information and stories that I had never heard before. I really wanted to take people kind of in the locker rooms and the boardrooms. So I think it will be really interesting for fans of the U.S. women's national team. It comes out on April 2nd. It's called The National Team, and it's available for pre-order now. So,
and who gave you? I have to ask, who gave you the most to write about? As in, either who told you the most stuff, or who did you hear the most stuff about on like a consistent basis?
Well, anyone who follows the team knows that Hope Solo has been
that was going to be my guess.
It has been a source of excitement over the years. So I did speak to her for the book. She definitely is a big part of the story. But I mean, also, a player like Julie Foudy, I don't think people necessarily know how much she did behind the scenes for the national team over the years when she was playing for the national team and when she was captain. And even now as someone who sort of advises the team and, Julie Foudy, I think, I spoke to her a lot for this book. She provided a lot of great stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick. I interviewed so many people who were so gracious with their time and had so many interesting things to say. But off the top of my head, I would say those two.
All right. Well, can we just like pencil it in that you'll be back on the show closer to the World Cup and around the time your book comes out, so we can talk a little more women's national team, but also talk about your book some more?
Yes, absolutely. I would love that.
Excellent. All right. Well, then, thank you, Caitlin, very much for taking the time. It was short notice, so thank you, and it was a lot of kind of meandering on the fly questions. So thank you for handling all of that quite well.
Yep. Thank you.